Hi guys, Mrs. Vance again, and today's topic is biodiversity. So we're going to talk about a lot of different kinds of things in this particular part of notes because this is kind of the culmination of everything about that's important for us to understand about ecology. Okay, and so we'll talk about keystone species, invasive species, what biodiversity is, and how these various things impact biodiversity. So biodiversity is talking about whether you have when you have a lot of species richness and relative abundance of various species. So you have here in the picture at the bottom, you have two different plots of land. Both have the same number of trees. Okay, they both have, let's say, 100 trees. Okay, but what you see is not only is there a lot of biomass going on there, okay, but you've also got a proportional representative of different species. When you have low species diversity, like you have over here, most of the trees are the same kind of tree. That actually is not as beneficial to the ecosystem as a whole as it is when you have a lot of species richness, the number of different species in the community. Low species diversity is characteristic of modern agricultural ecosystems, and so we end up with something called monocultures that utilize most of the nutrients in the soil and don't get replenished, whereas if you have a lot of species diversity, then you have some nutrients that are being used more so by some species than others, and others replenish some of those, and so you end up with a lot more healthy ecosystem. When you look at those particular woodlots that we looked at on the previous slide, you'll see that they both have about 100 trees, but in woodlot A, most of the species were the same species. You had 80 of these trees and only 10 of these, 5 of these, and 5 of these, whereas in the other woodlot, you had still 100 trees, but you had it more evenly distributed. And so that's going to be a lot more species richness, species abundance, rather than having too much of one thing. So there are various things that can impact biodiversity, and so we'll talk about some of those. Some of those have to do with living things, while some of them have to do with non-living components, the abiotic components of the ecosystem. So one thing that happens sometimes in ecosystems is you end up with something called a trophic cascade. A trophic cascade is an ecological event triggered by either the addition of or removal of a top predator, and the changes in the dynamics of the ecosystem and how that affects the species richness or the biodiversity of the ecosystem. And so we're going to look at a couple of different examples. I will also post a couple of other videos for you that are really good at showing you what happens. One thing that has happened in the Yellowstone National Park area, back in the 1920s, the government basically tried to remove a lot of the wolves because they were preying on the ranchers' cattle, and so there was a big extermination project to get rid of the wolves. What happened as a result of that is that you ended up with overgrowth of some of the other populations, and it actually depleted some of the resources that were available in the Yellowstone region. In 1995, they actually brought the wolves back, and it really altered the landscape and made for a much more variable and valued biodiversity in that park area, and made a big difference in the ecosystem there. Another example here in coastal ecosystems, if you end up with a healthy ecosystem, here we have otters and various kinds of seaweed, as well as sea urchins and other animals there. You have a very good stable ecosystem there, and it's very resilient and maintains things on an even keel. But if you remove the top predator, in this case that would be the sea otter, then you end up with an overabundance of the animals that actually destroy a lot of the plant life, and that makes it much less stable, and therefore you end up with things like erosion of the coastline because you don't have that stability that's present there. So we'll look at some examples like that. The species that has the greatest effect on the trophic cascade is what we call a keystone species. Keystone species are usually top predators. They may not always be, but sometimes they are. They may not be super abundant, but when you remove those from the community, it results in much less species diversity. So here's an example of a keystone species here. The sharks in this ecosystem are apex predators. They feed on these cownose rays, and the cownose rays feed on various bivalves like clams and shrimp and crab, things like that. When you remove the sharks, that increases since the sharks feed on the cow-nosed rays, if you don't have the sharks there, then you're going to have a greater number of cow-nosed rays, and they're going to eat up all of the arthropods and mollusks that are present there, and that's going to end up with much less species diversity, and that's going to have a negative effect on the cow-nosed rays, which messes up the whole ecosystem. So the keystone comes from this wedge-shaped stone that masons would put at the top of an arch to kind of give stability to the arch. When the keystone is not there, then the whole arch collapses, and that's the idea behind the keystone species. There are some species, absolutely, that have a disproportionate impact on the diversity of an ecosystem. This was first proposed by ecologist Robert Payne, and he looked at a particular ecosystem where there were starfish and mussels and so forth in a particular coastal area. And he removed some of a lot of the starfish, most of the starfish, from one particular cove. And over time, that led to a lot of overgrowth of the mussels, which the starfish fed on, and that changed the whole stability of the ecosystem. Once the starfish were returned, then you had a much more stable ecosystem as a result of that. Here are some examples of keystone species. So here's the wolf, of course. In some ecosystems, the sea otters definitely were keystone species there. It doesn't always have to be a top predator. Sometimes it's just something like an elephant that is actually a herbivore, but that would keep the ecosystem stable because of its presence there. So there are lots of examples of keystone species in various ecosystems. Now, when biodiversity is lost, it can not only lead to the loss of ecosystems, it can lead to the loss of species, as well as genes in species that remain. There are three main levels of biodiversity. That's ecosystem diversity, having a lot of different things available in the ecosystem. Species diversity, having a number of different species that interact with each other. And genetic diversity. So it also provides a lot of things that are necessary for the continuation of a society. And so making sure that we maintain biodiversity is really, really important in the maintenance of our society. Well, here we have a graph that shows the relative abundance of different kinds of animals. And it shows the bar graph, this is a stacked bar graph that shows animals that have the lowest risk of extinction and ones that are near threatened and are extinct or are really threatened to have a high risk of extinction there. Notice the amphibians, okay? Many more, over 40% of amphibians species are threatened at a very high risk of extinction. and about another 10% or more are near threatened, so they're very, very close. And these are kind of like an index species that kind of gives us an idea of how endangered the biodiversity is in a particular ecosystem. So what threatens biodiversity? Habitat loss is a major thing. Human alteration of habitats is probably the single greatest threat to biodiversity in the whole world. Okay, another thing that is really threatening is invasive species. Invasive species are species that were not normally a part of that particular ecosystem, but they come when they're introduced into an ecosystem, whether purposely or accidentally. They actually disrupt the community, because they don't have any natural enemies there, and they can parasitize or prey on native species and reduce their numbers. Harvesting of trees or crops at rates that exceeds the population's ability to rebound is a big threat in a lot of places. And here you see the large areas of forests are just depleted here because they can't grow back as fast as we're cutting them down. Invasive species oftentimes have been introduced by human activity, whether it's purposely or not. Sometimes it is something that's meant to be something to stabilize the ecosystem. In the southern United States, southeastern United States, there's an invasive vine called kudzu. It was really originally introduced as a way to help prevent erosion of certain rocks, but kudzu didn't have any any natural enemies, so to speak, any animals that really ate it, and it just grows like crazy. You can almost see it growing as fast as it possibly can. You can almost watch it grow, and so there are large areas of the South that they're fighting against the encroachment of kudzu into natural areas. The zebra mussel is another thing that was introduced. I think this was an accidental introduction, but it basically messes up a lot of aquatic ecosystems in the waterways to which it's been introduced. And then here we have a python that in the Florida Everglades, and they have had a major impact on the species diversity, the biodiversity in the Everglades. So all of these things can definitely cause problems. We also have human activities that make various kinds of pollutants that can affect ecosystems a long way from their source. Here we have a pelican that's damaged by the oil spill from the Deepwater Horizon oil well that spewed oil into the Gulf of Mexico for several years, a few years ago. We also have something called biological magnification that concentrates these various toxins that can't be broken down by the ecosystem, because if you incorporate some of it into the phytoplankton and zooplankton, and then these fish eat the phytoplankton and zooplankton, and the larger fish eat those, and then the seagulls eat those, you end up with a high level of the pollutants that can't be broken down in nature in those top level predators, and that ends up being damaging to their survival, because oftentimes when they're able to lay eggs, oftentimes the eggs break and the chicks die before they have a chance to mature, and that ends up messing up the stability of the ecosystem as well. Another thing that affects our world, of course, is rapid warming, and that's changing our global climate. We have rising concentrations of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide that are produced largely by human activities. Carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and those are changing climate patterns, and there are various consequences. We've seen a lot of extreme weather, both cold and hot, over the past few years, and a lot of that is due to human activity. A lot of the increase in the greenhouse gases comes from burning fossil fuels like oil and coal. Now, carbon dioxide can be absorbed by photosynthetic organisms, but when we cut down a lot of forests, they're also decreasing the number of carbon molecules or carbon dioxide molecules that can be incorporated into this. It also can be absorbed into the ocean, where it decreases the pH of the ocean, which has a negative effect on organisms that make shells of calcium carbonate. That's including corals and crabs and things like that. We have to cut our carbon emissions. It's really difficult to do sometimes because we have to change a lot of the way we like to do things. But it has an effect not only on the polar bears, since the ice caps are melting and they have a smaller and smaller range where to live. It's also affecting things like the wildfires in California and in Texas in the summertime because of the increased heat and the inability to deal with that. Another prominent feature of most communities is something called disturbance. Disturbances are things that damage the communities, and these include things like storms and fires and floods, volcanoes and so forth, and as well as human activity. And this leads to something called succession. Ecological succession is how the species composition of a community changes over time. And you probably have learned some about this in middle school. So primary succession is when you have the gradual colonization of barren rocks. Here we have a lava flow that's just starting to have some plant growth on it. The first plants are usually things like mosses and lichens that can grow pretty much on bare rock, followed by ferns and other small plants, and eventually small animals, and then larger plants can grow. But you don't have any soil there, and so it takes a pretty good amount of time for that to happen. Secondary succession occurs after some kind of disturbance has destroyed the community but left the soil intact. So you still got soil. This was a result of a forest fire. And it didn't take nearly as long for the resurgence of that particular ecosystem because the soil was already there, and the plants just had to have a chance to grow back, and so it didn't take as long for that succession to happen as it would for something like a primary succession. Of course, this leads us to talk about something called conservation. And conservation is seeking to understand and counter that loss of biodiversity. So what we're looking at doing is sustaining ecosystems and landscapes, having interacting with various ecosystems like forests and fields, wetlands and streams, the resurgence of and rehabilitation of some of those things that have been damaged by human activity. And so providing all those various habitats and rehabilitating those habitats increases the biodiversity. Again, it makes for a much healthier ecosystem. Restoring those degraded habitats is something called restoration ecology. Okay, and this uses various principles to return those areas back to their natural state, and that can include lots of different things: detoxifying polluted areas, large-scale projects that are trying to restore damaged landscapes. Sometimes areas may have been strip mined that need to be rehabilitated there. Restoring waterways that have been overused and overdrained, and so restoring the river and the wetlands improves the wildlife habitat and makes for, again, for more biodiversity in that area. The ultimate goal, of course, is something called sustainable development, and that means when we develop new areas, making it so that you can meet the needs of the people without limiting the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. We have a lot of work to do in the world. We need to look at more knowledge about how to work together toward long-term stability, to cut down on our overuse of fossil fuels and try to repair a lot of the damage that we've done to the ecosystem, to the biosphere, as a result of human activity over the last couple of hundred years.